Ukraine has shifted the direction of its attacks to the historical peninsula of the Black Sea. In recent days, Ukrainian drones have frequently flown over the Crimean skies. In addition to drone attacks, long-range missiles and sabotage actions have brought the tension in the peninsula to its peak. Crimea is seen as the key to ending the war in Ukraine. For this reason, attacks on the peninsula are gaining momentum. What is happening in Crimea, which carries the flag of independence in Ukraine's freedom struggle? Huge explosions occurred on the main railway line in the city of Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, yesterday. As a result of the explosion, 8 Russian military wagons were derailed. 50 meters of the track were damaged. A 1.5-meter-long crater was formed under the tracks. The movement of electric trains in the Simferopol-Svistopol section is suspended, according to Oleg Krychkov, the so-called advisor to the president of Crimea. Passengers will be transported to the necessary stations by buses. As is known, Crimea is critical for Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. An explosion on the railroad tracks in Crimea disrupted the delivery of supplies and weapons to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, including Kalibr cruise missiles. The Simferopol train line also extends as far as Russia's Krasnodar Oblast and connects to Taman port. Military freight trains are of critical importance for logistics because it is the only option for transporting high-tonnage military ammunition and weapons. The attack on this critical line in Simferopol severely disrupted the Russian defense and logistics of Crimea. Also, Crimea has hosted numerous attacks in recent weeks, including multiple drone attacks on the region's largest city, Sevastopol, in the northern part of the peninsula. Ukrainian drones attacked the Russian airport of Xi'an-Koy, the Russian railway line and military depot in Myslova, and the Russian Navy base in Sevastopol. The common purpose of these attacks may be to disrupt the logistics with the Kherson region by neutralizing the Russian logistics network in the north of Crimea. The explosion of the Simferopol train line in Crimea, the drone attack on the Russian warship in the Black Sea, and the blowing up of the Russian supply lines and oil depots near the Kerch Bridge are crossing Putin's red lines and cornering him. Russian residents of the peninsula are waiting for an opportunity to flee in fear and panic. The Russian authorities in Crimea, on the other hand, are in a state of serious panic. Although the Crimean Peninsula is the most strategic region of the Black Sea, it is home to 2.5 million people. While the Russians make up 58% of the population of Crimea, Ukrainians make up 24%, and Crimean Tatars 12%. Other ethnic groups also live there. About 1 million of the Russians living on the peninsula were illegally resettled to the peninsula after the annexation of Crimea. On the other hand, the fear of the Ukrainian armed forces is causing Russian soldiers to flee from Crimea. The evacuation of Russian headquarters in Crimea and the evacuation of Russian military families. Last month, the Russian-backed military authorities of Crimea announced the evacuation of Russian military families from the peninsula. It was a sharp move unleashed by great anxiety and fear. It was also an indication that the Russians could not cope with the Ukrainian attacks. The evacuation of Russian headquarters outside of Crimea in the past weeks was also a vivid symbol of the uneasiness of the Russians. In this week's update, UK intelligence revealed a very dire situation for the Russian military in Crimea. British intelligence pointed out that the main element of the Russian garrison, the 22nd Corps, has now mostly fled outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The majority of the fleeing soldiers belong to the 22nd Russian Corps. The 22nd Russian Corps is a unit of the coastal defense units of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy. Since last August, Russian military headquarters, airports, train tracks, logistics centers, fuel depots, and the Russian Navy base in Crimea have been the target of many attacks. As a result, while the Russian army doubled its troop presence in Crimea, it had to evacuate the people and their relatives in some regions. The atmosphere of fear and panic as a result of the attacks forced the Russians in the peninsula to sell their houses and flee. Many times there were queues of Russians fleeing the peninsula on the Kerch Bridge. Train and ferry services were filled with Russians fleeing in fear. This was one of the main aims of the Ukrainian attacks. It is estimated that around 350,000 Russian citizens have fled the peninsula so far. Ukrainian officials responsible for the Crimean region have also confirmed this, but they state that insufficient evacuations, escapes, and the relocation of military formations to other regions paint the clearest picture of the tension and psychological collapse in Crimea. In addition to the Ukraine attack, anti-Kremlin Russian partisan groups are also causing tension in Crimea to rise. Russian volunteers announced a cross-border raid on occupied Crimea and spoke to the local population via radio. Radio stations in temporarily occupied Crimea announced the call with Russia's Freedom Legion and militias planning to cross into Crimea shortly. In their announcement, the separatist Russians stated that they see it as their duty to help clear the peninsula from war criminal Putin. The Russian Freedom Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps asked the people of Crimea to remain calm and help themselves as much as possible. These attacks on the Black Sea Peninsula stem from Ukraine's ideal of liberation. So how can Ukraine get Crimea back from Putin's hands? Ukraine has outlined a plan for how it can reclaim control of Crimea from Putin's hands. The plan includes dismantling the massive 19-kilometer bridge between Crimea and Russia, which has been dubbed Europe's longest bridge located between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Crimea is home to tens of thousands of deployed Russian soldiers and numerous Russian military bases. White House officials insist there has been no change in position. They state that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. In fact, the United States is one step closer to crossing Putin's red line by suggesting a way to neutralize Crimea. The United States argues that Ukraine can seize Crimea without violence. U.S. diplomats and many senior officials are suggesting the blockade option to curb Russian aggression. According to a former U.S. diplomat, both countries are likely on the verge of launching new attacks. According to the diplomat, a blockade of Crimea from Russian aggression is a better option than the Ukrainian attempt to seize the region. The U.S. diplomat is not alone in his views. Voices for Ukraine's blockade of Crimea are increasing. Retired U.S. Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges has urged Kiev forces to isolate Crimea using long-range precision strikes. Hodges said to drive back the Black Sea Fleet with daily precision strikes from Sevastopol. Do the same for the Russian Air Force at Saki. Ukraine can use low-cost explosive unmanned surface ships for swarm attacks against Russian warships stationed in Sevastopol. The concept is simple. Loaded with cameras and explosives, low-profile USVs are aimed at targets. This emerging technology could sink warships and destroy naval infrastructure. The blockade approach could be part of a successful strategy to return Crimea to Ukraine. It is not possible to predict when this strategy will be implemented. In another development, the attacks in Crimea have caused the Kremlin to take some measures in Crimea. Satellite snapshots of Crimea reveal Russian coastal defenses that include dragon's teeth, trenches, and bunkers. Russia has transformed Crimea from a popular seaside resort into a military line of defense, with satellite images showing the peninsula overrun with anti-tank barriers and crisscrossed by reinforced trench nets. For starters, there are concrete dragon's teeth structures resembling pyramids along the coastline. Tanks and other military vehicles are specifically prohibited from passing through these structures. There are several trenches on the peninsula that provide defense against incoming attackers behind the dragon's teeth. It's also possible to see numerous bunkers along the trenches that function as additional defensive positions. The presence of dragon's tooth stocks, excavation equipment, and piles of trees near the Crimean coastline indicate that construction work is ongoing. As a result, Crimea will always be at one end of the war between Russia and Ukraine. How will the attacks on the Black Sea Peninsula shape the war in Ukraine in the coming days? The war between Ukraine and Russia changed the military, economic, and political balances in many parts of the world. Along with Eastern Europe, Baltic and Scandinavian geographies are maximizing their military measures against Russia's aggressive moves and unprovoked aggression. With Finland's accession to NATO, tensions began to rise in the Baltic Sea last week as the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Porter was heading towards the Baltic Sea. The Russian Navy conducted a massive naval exercise in the Baltic against NATO. In response, NATO navies have just begun their biggest exercise of the year against the Russian Navy in the Baltic Sea. Major two-week joint exercises of NATO and Baltops partners are starting. This development was announced by Estonian and Finnish authorities. Among other exercises, the exercises will be conducted under the leadership of the U.S. Navy 6th Fleet Commander. The purpose of the exercise is to increase the interoperability and coordination of the Allied forces. Thus, the Allied forces plan to implement all aspects of conducting joint combat operations at sea. Approximately 6,000 military personnel, 50 ships and approximately 45 aircraft and helicopters from 20 countries will participate in the exercises. Exercise participants started arriving in Estonia last week. The Estonian Navy points out that this is a historic event for the country, as it is the first exercise of this scale in Estonian waters. The exercise also went down in history as the largest multinational exercise in the Baltic Sea since 1972. Tallinn Port of Estonia and Helsinki Port of Finland are located at the entrance of the Baltic Strait. The continuation of this strait leads to St. Petersburg, Russia's only port on the Baltic. A power that can be created in this region could completely destroy Russia's presence in the Baltic Sea. The Russian Navy's forces in the Black Sea and Mediterranean are heavily suppressed, and Russia's Baltic Navy makes up the majority of the remaining naval power of the Russian army. However, the Baltic Sea, which has officially become a NATO lake with the Finland's accession to NATO, shows us that things will not go well for the Russian Navy here. Since the Ukraine war started, especially the U.S. Navy has been active in the region. The U.S. Navy, which carries out regular exercises with its NATO allies on the Baltic coast, seems to have broken the Russian Navy's influence over the Baltic to a large extent. The Estonian Navy has long been working with the U.S. Navy to increase maritime surveillance and security of the Estonian coast. Estonian officials reported. The work also includes securing pipelines and cables running under the Gulf of Finland. As highlighted in last year's Nord Stream pipeline explosions, collaboration is vital given the Russian Navy's interest in seafloor infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. In addition, the Russian Navy has a program in place to sabotage the energy infrastructure of public broadcasters in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, including undersea cables and wind farm superstructures. Estonian Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur stated that after the Nord Stream incident, he gave the Estonian Navy the task to control both the Baltic Connector and Estonian cables with Finland. Baltic Connector is a natural gas pipeline opened in 2019. While Estlink consists of electric cables connecting Estonia and Finland. Pevkur states, "We did this and didn't find anything appropriate. We just found some old sea mines a little further from the connections, but nothing else," he said. The minister said that the continuous inspection of the infrastructure is the responsibility of the owner of the connections, namely the state transmission systems operator Elering. However, Pevkur added that if the need arises to respond to a threat, the Navy will do so. Not only the Estonian Navy, but also the navies of the allied nations are involved. The U.S. Marine Corps unit, the USMC, is under the command of U.S. Task Force 61, which is attached to the U.S. 6th Fleet and includes U.S. Marine Corps personnel and their amphibious assault ships. It is necessary to understand what is happening in the maritime sphere in the Gulf of Finland, in the northern Baltic Sea, around the Estonian coastline. Thus, in the event of a conflict against an enemy, both the U.S. forces, naval forces, the 6th Fleet, and the Estonian Defense Forces can respond. So, has the USMC unit previously assisted Estonia on the Baltic issue? This is the second time that the USMC unit has assisted Estonia in its maritime awareness effort. The U.S. uses mobile radar telescopes, drones, and other technologies to identify areas of interest along Estonia's long coastline, including its islands. The U.S. Naval Operations Center is located right next to the Estonian Navy. This work also suppressed conscripts following Norway's model. Currently, there are 4 such staff members. The Estonian Navy Operations Center had half the 20 people we needed in the summer of 2022, so we had to recruit a dozen. The situation today is that we have a team of 20 people together with the recruits and the people we recruit, he said. The Maritime Border Surveillance business was transferred from the Police and Border Guard Board, aka PPR, to the Navy earlier this year following restructuring. And preparatory work began the previous summer. As stated, PPA personnel previously assigned to maritime surveillance duties were subsequently transferred to other roles. However, closely monitoring Russia's operations in the Baltic Sea does not mean that Russia will not do them. As a result, although the Baltic Sea is surrounded by NATO allies, it cannot be said that the navies of the countries in the region are very effective against the Russian Navy. This year, Russia demonstrated its influence and capabilities by conducting major military exercises in remote corners of the world, despite heavy losses in Ukraine. Exercises in the Indian and Pacific Oceans show that the Russian army is not in retreat, and the Kremlin is not as isolated as Kiev and its supporters would like. But experts say the forces deployed to send this message will lose as Moscow begins to rebuild its army. Russian officials have said in recent months that the guided missile frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, and a tanker ship will be deployed to Africa for an exercise hosted by South Africa in February, the first of Russia's Project 202,350 class frigates. Gorshkov is equipped with Zircon hypersonic missiles, a class of weapons that Moscow was touted as invincible. So what was the content of this exercise? During the exercise called Mosey, 2 Russian ships trained with South African and Chinese warships. The Russians then sailed east for a drill with Chinese and Iranian ships in mid-March and made a port visit in Saudi Arabia, a first for a Russian warship, before heading to the Russian base in the Syrian port of Tartus. While China and Iran are 2 of Russia's biggest backers, South Africa has declared itself neutral in the war in Ukraine. South Africa maintains good relations with Washington and Moscow, but downplayed the exercise with South Africa's foreign minister, calling it a joint exercise with friends. But both opposition politicians and the United States have criticized the Republic of South Africa for allowing its military to showcase its capabilities on the anniversary of Russia's attack on Ukraine. Also recently, the U.S. accused South Africa of supplying arms and ammunition to Moscow. Although the Russian Navy is touted as weak, it is above the navies of the Baltic countries in terms of size. This situation puts Russia no more than a threat to the Baltic states. Although the U.S. DAX forces are often in the Baltic Sea, the Baltic power of the Russian Navy is likely to cause great problems for the countries in the region in the future if it is not prevented. Russian Navy ships and why Vladimir Putin to Turkish waters blown up. The blowing up of a Russian Navy ship in Turkish waters has sparked a new dispute between Vladimir Putin and President Erdogan. The Russian Navy sent to anchor in the Turkish Strait faced an unexpected attack. In recent weeks, U.S. Navy ships have entered Turkish waters and anchored in the Bosphorus. The anchoring of U.S. Navy ships in the straits quickly entered the world agenda. It is claimed that the U.S. ships anchored in the Turkish Straits to send a message to Russia's ships in the Black Sea, addressing President Erdogan with the arrival of the U.S. ships. Putin said that he wanted to remind once again that the U.S. Navy ships do not have the right to pass through the Bosphorus, stating that Turkey would be committing a legal crime if these ships pass through the Bosphorus and reach the Black Sea. Putin is worried about the U.S. ships reaching the Black Sea. The Russian leader, who wants to take precautions just in case, has sent Russian Navy ships in the Crimean port of Sevastopol to the Black Sea offshore. However, the U.S. Navy ships never crossed the strait and sailed towards the Black Sea. Months after this incident, Vladimir Putin sent a Russian Navy ship to Turkish waters to send a message to the U.S. and Western countries. Entering Turkish waters, the Russian Navy was to anchor in the Bosphorus as the United States had done with this move. Putin wanted to show that he was on good terms with Erdogan, who won the presidential election in Turkey again. But there were some things Putin did not take into account here. The Navy ships that Turkey had sent to Ukraine because Russian Navy ships posed a threat in the Black Sea were still anchored in Turkey. The Ukrainian Navy ships that were ready and waiting on the Turkish Black Sea coasts were completely forgotten by the Russian government. As it is known, Turkey provided for Navy ships to the Ukrainian Navy months ago. However, due to Russia's threatening actions, the Ukrainian crews had not yet left the Turkish shore. As soon as the Ukrainian intelligence service learned that the Russian Navy ship was on its way to enter Turkish waters, it took action. The Ukrainian Naval Command mobilized the Navy ships it had kept ready in Turkey and ordered the destruction of the Russian Navy. Unaware of anything, the Russian Navy and its crew continued to move forward to anchor in the Bosphorus. However, as the Russian Navy ship approached the straits, 3 Ukrainian-flagged Navy ships blockaded the Russian ship due to the distance. The Russian crew at first sheltered. These ships belonged to Turkey. However, when the Ukrainian Navy ships started to open fire, the Russian crew was surprised. Ukrainian soldiers shelled the Russian Navy ship, firing cannon after cannon before the Russian crew could even respond. The Navy ship was heavily damaged. The heavily damaged Russian Navy ship tried to get away from the area by changing its course to avoid further shelling by Ukrainian Navy ships. When Ukrainian soldiers saw that the Russian Navy was heavily damaged, they stopped shelling. The Russian Navy tried to quickly escape from Turkish waters, returned to the Crimean port of Sevastopol. The attack on the Russian Navy ship by the Ukrainian army in Turkish waters has infuriated Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Putin, who is known to be in close relations with Turkish President Erdogan, said that this attack was unacceptable and that Turkey should not allow it. Criticizing the fact that Russia was not informed that the Ukrainian Navy ships were on the Black Sea coast, Putin stated that such information should have been conveyed. Putin's last word was that these Navy ships that attack the Russian Navy will be destroyed as soon as possible. The destruction of the Russian Navy ship in Turkish waters has become a big news item on all over the world. As it is known, Russia has lost many Navy ships since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army organized many air operations against Russian Navy ships. Vladimir Putin lost more than 10 naval ships as a result of air strikes with long-range missiles and unmanned fighter jets. Now, for the first time, Ukrainian and Russian Navy ships have faced each other and clashed. Vladimir Putin is doing everything he can to keep control of the Black Sea, realizing that if he loses control of the Black Sea, the Ukrainian army will launch attacks from the sea. Putin has 11 Navy ships, known as Russia's Black Sea Fleet, on standby. However, the fact that a Russian Navy ship was attacked by the Ukrainian Navy while Russia was in control of the Black Sea seems to have embarrassed Putin all over the world. Putin, who has recently become uneasy due to the operations organized by the Ukrainian army, has started to increase security measures considerably. In the past days, pro-Ukrainian soldiers entered Russia's borders and carried out an operation which caused a great panic in the Kremlin. The Ukrainian army had entered the Russian borders for the first time and seized Russian territory. Now, Putin, who has lost another Navy ship, continues to inflict heavy damage as the war drags on. In the first months of the war, Putin was able to continue with the occupation of Ukrainian territory very quickly, but now he is forced to defend the territory he has occupied. The course of the war has changed drastically, and the Ukrainian army is now on the offensive. In a recent statement, Putin said that the Ukrainian army's offensive, which has been planned for months, has begun as of now, and that the Ukrainian army has launched an offensive in many regions, including Russian territory. In response, Putin started to create minefields to increase security measures in the occupied territories. At the same time, Putin has started to place barricades to prevent tanks and armored vehicles from entering, and he is very afraid of losing the occupied territories. But what Putin is really afraid is losing the Crimean Peninsula. As it is well known, most of the shipments of weapons and ammunition to Russian troops in Ukraine are carried out through the Crimean Peninsula. The delivery trucks arrive in Crimea via the Kerch Bridge, which is the only road connection between Russia and Crimea, and are sent to Ukrainian territory via Crimea. However, as it is known, the Ukrainian army occasionally conducts airstrikes on Crimean territory. In recent months, the Ukrainian army has carried out an airstrike on the Russian military airbase in Crimea, destroying a large number of fighter jets and helicopters. At the same time, the Kerch Bridge, which was recently exploded by sabotage, scared Putin. Now the Ukrainian army is on the offensive again, making Putin even more nervous. If the Ukrainian army launches a ground offensive against Crimea and seizes it, most of the Russian troops on Ukrainian territory will be forced to withdraw. To prevent this from happening, Putin has started to organize new military deployments to Crimea, having decided to send a large number of air defense systems to Crimea. Putin has sent to Pantsir air defense systems to protect the Kerch Bridge alone. Instead of attacking the positions of the Russian army, the Ukrainian army is now attacking the supply routes used by Russia in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army, which started to target the supply routes such as railways, highways, and bridges used by Russian forces, has achieved great success with this new strategy. With the restriction of the Russian army's supply routes, Russian soldiers fighting in Ukrainian territory have started to experience difficulties in the supply of ammunition and weapons. Recently, we have been hearing news about Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine have been on strike due to the shortage of ammunition and supplies. Although Vladimir Putin has made great efforts to prevent the news of these striking soldiers, According to information obtained from regional sources, it is known that many Russian soldiers have laid down their arms and protested against Putin.